of itself. But anyway, we find here that they begin to build and they see what it is, and God tells them it ain't about the size of the building. I thought we might put it this way, Roy. It ain't the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog. That may be a crazy illustration to use to make this point. But God is reminding them that it's not about the size of the building. Now let me take a quick application and keep going. The size of our building needs not to dictate the size of our ministry. The size of our building needs not to dictate the size of our ministry or the size of our footprint, if you want to put it that way, for the glory of God. He said that we're going to the highways and hedges and compel them to come in. I tell folks, I preach and teach here at the church, and I love the church. Don't get me wrong. I preach and teach here at church. Make no mistake, the ministry is outside of these walls. Ministry and the people. The builders are beginning to get discouraged when they don't see the results if that they had hoped for, if you want to put it that way. In verse 9, they're reminded that the millennial temple that is to come will be the biggest and the greatest ever, but right now that's not what they're seeing. Pause. Have you ever started out to do something for the Lord and you know that God called you to do it, but the results just ain't there? You do everything you know to do. You pray. This ain't about me. This ain't about Temple. It's about all of us. You pray. You seek God's face. I mean, take the disciples. I mean, they was doing everything. Wound up in storms. Wound up beheaded. Wound up crucified. Quick story. Kitty Suffield, some of you have heard me tell it before. Kitty Suffield was a well-known singer and pianist in the early 1900s and was traveling by train all over southern Canada and northern United States doing concerts and was a headline act. She was a headline act. She was like, pardon me, the Dolly of her time. I don't mean that. She was a really big deal. She was doing a concert tour in October in Canada, and an early storm hit, and it was white out, and they had to stop the train, and everybody on the train got out and went into a farmhouse. Oh, this is a true story. Went into the farmhouse to wait out the storm. When the storm was over, they got back on the train, and off they went again, but not until Kitty and the owner, the man that owned the farmhouse, exchanged information, and over the next year or so, there were letters written, you can tell where I'm convincing, written backwards and forwards, led to a budding romance, led to love, led to marriage, and that's why you've never heard of Kitty Suffield. She quit her career, of fame and fortune, and went and lived in a little obscure farmhouse in Ottawa, Canada. They attended a small church, and the pastor had a son whose name was George. And George loved Miss Kitty. Immediately, gun smoke comes to my mind. George loved Miss Kitty. And he'd go down to Miss Kitty's house after school. And Miss Kitty taught young George how to play the piano and how to sing. And you know young George is George Beverly Shea. But that's not the end of the story. Miss Kitty, like me, only ever wrote one song in her whole life. Anybody know the song? Little is much when God is in it. Labor not for wealth and fame. There's a crown, and you can win it if you trust in Jesus' name. That was God's second message. He had been blunt with them in chapter 1. And sometimes we need blunt, don't we? Just to be honest about it. Sometimes we need blunt. Daddy used to say, plain talk is easily understood. In chapter 1, he had been blunt, maybe even punitive with them. But when they started doing what God told them to do, then we find him in the beginning of chapter 2, encourage them, and that brings us to the last message, where we find a message of examination. And God gives the leaders, the priests that are serving there. Apparently there were other priests under the high priest Yeshua, and he gives them 2 questions to ponder. Now, my favorite Bible commentator, his name is William MacDonald. And William MacDonald described the questions as follows. The first question asks, if holy meat carried in the fold of a garment should touch other foods, do those other foods become holy because they were touched by the holy meat? And the answer is no. No. The second question, however, in verse 13 asks, if one who has become unclean by touching a dead body should touch these same foods, would they become unclean? And the answer is yes. So the idea here, strange as it may seem, I can't impart holiness unto anybody. Only God can do that. But I can lead them astray. I can be a stumbling block unto others. And I can even go to the extreme that God couldn't really use my ministry anymore because I'm not living the way. That was what was going on here. Now, the interrogation, if you want to call it that, captures the essence of the entire problem in this book, or the entire purpose of the book of Haggai. And the problem was that their offerings were polluted, or considered by God to be polluted. And even them themselves were considered to be out of God's will, therefore not in the place where God can use them. Not only the offerings, but the offerers were out of the path of the righteousness. And God is calling them to account for that. You've heard me say many times, however, that God never presents a problem without also presenting the solution. Now, some of these Old Testament illustrations, like the meat touching something else, all that's weird to us. We don't live in that economy anymore, but we do understand the call to holiness and the call not to be impure or unholy, okay? And that's what's sort of going on there, and he is equating their laziness with being unholy, okay? Well, okay. But he says, if you'll return, in verses 18 and 19, if you'll get to work, if You'll strive to be what I've called you to be, to do what I've called you to do, to live the way that I've called you to live. Once again, you will see my blessings presented or bestowed upon you. In chapter 1, I'm nearly done. I don't have my watch on today, so I don't know what I'm in. In chapter 1, they hadn't been doing what God said to do. The gardens wouldn't grow. Their cows were famished. Agriculture was, they lived off the land, okay? And the land ain't producing. And they're asking, what's up with